My unemployed husband spent our $14,000 house down payment on toys while I worked overtime as a nurse. I sold his entire collection at 50% off. So when Brandon lost his job at the warehouse 8 months ago, I told him we'd be fine on my nurse salary while he looked for work. We'd been married 6 years and always supported each other. When I was in nursing school, he covered our bills. Now it was my turn. First month, he was motivated, updating his resume, going to interviews, and networking with old coworkers. By month 3, he'd discovered online auctions and vintage toy collecting. Started small with $20 action figures, he said, would triple in value. I didn't mind because he needed something to keep him busy between applications. Then the packages started arriving daily. $50 limited editions, $100 rare finds, $200 mint condition sets still in plastic. I asked him where the money came from, and he said he was selling stuff from storage. We didn't have anything in storage. Turns out he'd been transferring money from our joint savings to his personal PayPal. When I confronted him, he said it was an investment, that these toys would be worth thousands in a few years. I was pulling 12-hour shifts while he sat home bidding on plastic robots. I separated our finances and gave him an allowance for gas and food while job hunting. That lasted exactly 1 week before my credit card statement showed a $900 charge to some collectible shop in Japan. He'd memorized my card number. When I confronted him again, he said I was being controlling and unsupportive of his business venture. His business venture of buying toys, while I paid for everything. I canceled that card and got a new one I kept hidden. 2 weeks later, my mom called asking why I needed $3,000. Brandon had called her crying about how we were behind on bills because my hours got cut, and could she loan us money just this once? My hours were actually increased to overtime. Mom had already sent him the money through Zelle. He bought a limited edition train set that was apparently signed by some designer I'd never heard of. My sister Rita worked at our bank and pulled some strings to trace where all the money was going. It turns out Brandon had spent $14,000 in 4 months on toys. $14,000. We'd been saving that for a down payment on a house. Meanwhile, he'd gone to exactly 2 job interviews, both at places he knew wouldn't hire him because he showed up in sweats. Rita helped me open a new account at a different bank and reroute my direct deposit. Brandon didn't notice for 3 weeks because he was too busy arranging his collection in our spare room, which now looked like a toy store exploded. He'd installed special shelving and lighting, and even had a temperature control system he bought for $800 to preserve the plastic. When rent was due and the joint account was empty, he finally noticed. Came storming into the bedroom at midnight after my shift, demanding to know where his investment fund went. I told him that was my money for bills. He said we were partners and partners share everything. I asked him when he'd last contributed to that partnership. He said his collection was worth at least $30,000 now. I asked him to sell some for rent. He said I didn't understand collectible markets and the value would only go up. That's when I knew what had to do. Brandon went to a toy convention 2 hours away, said it was a networking opportunity for serious collectors. While he was gone, I called every single person on his collector forums. Posted in all his groups that I had an emergency sale. Husband's entire collection had to go immediately. 50% off market value, cash only, pick up today. His collector friends were vultures. They showed up within hours with cash in hand. His prized train set? Sold for $1,500 to some dealer who said Brandon had outbid him for it. The vintage robots? Gone for $2,000 to a guy who drove 3 hours when he heard about the sale. Every single piece. By the time Brandon got home, I'd made $21,000 cash. He walked into his toy room and just stood there staring at the empty shelves. Started screaming about how I'd robbed him, how those were priceless investments. I handed him an envelope with first and last month's rent for a studio apartment across town and a printed list of job openings. Told him he had 2 hours to pack his clothes. He called the police trying to report a theft. Officer showed up. I explained the situation, showed him my bank statements and pay stubs. Officer told Brandon that marital assets can be sold by either spouse, and maybe he should focus on finding employment. Brandon's mom called me every name in the book. I sent her copies of the bank statements showing what her unemployed son had spent on toys while I worked overtime to keep us afloat. She went quiet really fast. Brandon tried to contest the divorce, saying I destroyed his business assets. The judge asked for his business license, tax records, and any proof of income from this toy business. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Found out he had nothing. No business license, no tax records, no proof he'd ever sold a single toy or made $1 from his supposed investment business. The judge stared at him for what felt like forever, before asking if he was seriously claiming that buying toys with his wife's money counted as running a business. Brandon started stammering about market research and networking with other collectors, but the judge cut him off and said the motion was denied. Court would proceed as scheduled. I watched Brandon's face turn red as he realized he wasn't going to get what he wanted. His lawyer looked tired, like this wasn't the first ridiculous argument he'd had to make on Brandon's behalf. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I felt something lift off my shoulders that had been weighing me down for months. Brandon started yelling behind me in the parking lot about how I'd destroyed his life and stolen his future. His lawyer grabbed his arm and tried to pull him toward their car while Brandon kept screaming that I was a thief and a liar. I unlocked my car, got in and locked the doors while he was still carrying on. Started the engine and backed out while his lawyer physically guided him away from my vehicle. In my rearview mirror, I could see him gesturing wildly while his lawyer talked to him with his hands up like he was trying to calm down a wild animal. My phone rang around 7 that evening while I was heating up leftover pasta. Rita's name flashed on the screen. She asked how court went, and I told her about the judge's reaction to Brandon's business claims. She laughed and said she had something to tell me. Turns out she'd been monitoring credit applications because she had a feeling Brandon would try something. He'd attempted to open 3 new credit cards in the past week using our old joint address. She'd already flagged all of them with fraud alerts and contacted the credit bureaus to protect my score. I thanked her about 5 times before she told me to stop. That's what sisters do. She also mentioned she'd set up alerts on my credit report so I'd know immediately if anyone tried to open anything in my name. Next morning at the hospital, I was restocking supplies in the med room when my supervisor walked in. She stopped and looked at me for a second before asking if everything was okay at home, said I seemed different lately. I told her I was getting divorced and she immediately hugged me, which surprised me because she's usually pretty professional. She pulled back and said she could tell something had been draining me these past few months, that I'd seemed exhausted beyond just the physical demands of the job. Said she was glad I was taking care of myself. That conversation stayed with me through my whole shift, made me realize how much my marriage problems had been affecting my work without me even noticing. My mom called me the next afternoon sounding annoyed. Brandon's mom had just gotten off the phone with her trying to negotiate some kind of settlement where I'd give Brandon half the money from selling his toys. Mom said she actually laughed out loud and told her that Brandon was lucky I didn't sell everything at 25% off instead of 50%. Brandon's mom tried to argue that I'd destroyed valuable property, and my mom asked her if she'd seen the bank statements showing what her unemployed son spent while I worked overtime. The line went quiet after that, and Brandon's mom hung up. Mom said she was proud of me for not backing down, that too many women stay in situations like mine because they feel guilty or responsible. I logged into my bank account that evening and looked at the credit card balances Brandon had run up before I caught him. 3 cards with a combined total of almost $8,000, all from his toy purchases before I separated our finances. I'd been making minimum payments for months, watching the interest pile up while trying to cover rent and bills. Used some of the money from the toy sale to pay off all 3 cards in full. Watching those balances change to 0 felt better than I expected. Like erasing evidence of his financial abuse one payment at a time. Checked my savings account after that and saw it was actually growing again instead of shrinking. First time in months I'd seen the number go up instead of down. 2 weeks went by without hearing from Brandon. I was finishing up my shift at the hospital, charting notes at the nurse's station, when security called up asking if I knew a Brandon Miller. My stomach dropped. I told them he was my estranged husband and I didn't want to see him. The security guard said he was in the lobby asking to speak with me, getting agitated when they told him to wait. I explained the situation and 2 security officers went down to escort him out. They called back 10 minutes later to confirm he'd left the property and asked if I wanted them to flag him in their system. I said yes and thanked them. My hands were shaking when I hung up the phone. One of my coworkers asked if I was okay, and I told her what happened. She suggested I talk to the hospital social worker about getting a restraining order. Met with the social worker during my lunch break the next day. She listened to everything, took notes about Brandon showing up at my workplace, his behavior at the courthouse, the constant attempts to contact me. Said his pattern of behavior was concerning, and I should definitely consider legal protection. She gave me the name of a lawyer who specialized in restraining orders and domestic issues. I called during my break and got an appointment for 2 days later. The lawyer reviewed all the documentation I'd brought, including the bank statements, the police report from when Brandon tried to report the toy sale as theft, and the security report from the hospital. She said I had a strong case for harassment, and we could file for a temporary restraining order that day. The temporary restraining order got approved within 3 days. Judge signed it after reviewing Brandon's pattern of showing up uninvited at my workplace and his aggressive behavior. Order stated he had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, the hospital where I worked and my mom's house where I'd been staying since kicking him out. Violation would result in immediate arrest. My lawyer called to tell me the news and said the paperwork would be served to Brandon at his studio apartment that afternoon. I felt relieved and anxious at the same time, knowing this would probably make him angry but also knowing I'd have legal protection if he tried anything. Rita called that weekend saying she'd found a 1-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from the hospital with way better security than our old place. Building had a locked entrance, cameras in the hallways, and parking in a gated garage. Rent was actually $200 cheaper per month because I didn't need 2 bedrooms for a toy storage room. We drove over to look at it and I loved it immediately. Small but clean, updated kitchen, good water pressure in the shower. Filled out the application right there and got approved 2 days later thanks to my steady nursing income and clean credit. Move-in date was set for 3 weeks out, which gave me time to buy furniture and pack up the stuff I'd been keeping at my mom's house. I spent the first week in my new apartment just walking around touching things. The countertops were mine. The refrigerator hummed without hiding any secret credit card bills inside. I hung my own towels in the bathroom and arranged my coffee mugs however I wanted, without worrying about leaving space for collectible boxes. The kitchen cabinets were old, and the linoleum had cracks, but nobody could take this place from me. I worked a night shift and came home at 3 in the morning to silence instead of Brandon demanding to know where I'd been or why I hadn't answered his texts. My bed was smaller than the one we'd shared, but I slept better than I had in months. The building had a coded entry system and cameras everywhere. I gave the property manager a photo of Brandon and explicit instructions that he wasn't allowed inside under any circumstances. She made a note in her system and promised to alert all the staff. My phone started buzzing during a shift 2 days after I moved in. Unknown number. I ignored it and went back to checking vitals on my patient. It buzzed again 5 minutes later. Different unknown number. I blocked both and finished my rounds. By the time my break came, I had 7 missed calls from 7 different numbers. The voicemails were all Brandon begging me to just talk to him for 5 minutes. He swore he understood now. He'd get a job. He'd never buy another toy. Please just give him one more chance. I forwarded every single message to my lawyer's email with timestamps. She called me back within an hour saying this was clear restraining order violation, and she'd file the documentation with the court. Brandon kept texting from new numbers throughout my entire shift. I blocked each one and forwarded the messages. By morning, I had a folder with 23 separate violations documented with dates and times. The court date came 3 weeks later. I took the morning off and wore my nicest work clothes. Brandon showed up in jeans and a wrinkled shirt looking like he hadn't slept. His lawyer looked tired before the hearing even started. The judge reviewed the documentation my lawyer had submitted showing every text, every call, every voicemail from every different number Brandon had used. She asked Brandon if he understood what a restraining order meant. He started explaining how he just wanted to talk to his wife and work things out. The judge cut him off and said I wasn't his wife anymore. I was a person who had legal protection from his contact. She extended the restraining order for a full year and added a clause that any further violations would result in immediate arrest and possible jail time. Brandon's lawyer didn't even try to argue. He just nodded and packed up his briefcase while Brandon sat there staring at the table. I scheduled an appointment with the hospital's employee assistance program the next week. The therapist's office was small and had those generic motivational posters on the walls. She asked me to tell her what brought me in. I started with Brandon losing his job and ended with selling his toy collection and getting the restraining order extended. It took 45 minutes to get through the whole story. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked how I felt about everything that happened. I said I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, for making excuses for him, for thinking he'd change. She said that's how these situations work. The behavior starts small and builds gradually until you're living in something completely different from what you signed up for. We talked about how Brandon had gone from buying $20 toys to spending $14,000 in 4 months, how each boundary I set was ignored until I didn't have any boundaries left. She helped me see the pattern I'd been too close to recognize while I was living it. My coworkers asked if I wanted to go out for drinks after our shift ended on Friday. I almost said no out of habit because I was used to rushing home to deal with whatever Brandon's latest crisis was. Then I remembered I didn't have to do that anymore. We went to a bar 3 blocks from the hospital that had cheap wings and cheaper beer. I sat in a booth with 4 other nurses and we talked about everything except work. Someone told a story about their terrible first apartment. Someone else complained about their mother-in-law. I realized I hadn't done this in months, maybe longer. Every time my coworkers had invited me out, I'd made excuses because I needed to get home and check on Brandon, or because I was too tired from picking up extra shifts to cover his toy purchases. Sitting there laughing at stupid jokes and eating wings felt like something I'd forgotten I was allowed to do. Rita called me the next week and said her friend wanted to meet me. Her friend's name was Sakura Tanaka, and she'd gone through a divorce 2 years ago that sounded familiar. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital on my day off. Sakura was a teacher, and she looked put together in a way that made me feel hopeful. She told me about her ex-husband who'd gambled away their savings and lied about it for months. She talked about the shame she felt admitting her marriage was falling apart, and how long it took her to trust her own judgment again. I told her about the toys and the restraining order and feeling stupid for not leaving sooner. She said she'd felt the same way, but eventually realized that leaving when you're ready is better than staying because you're scared. We talked for 2 hours and exchanged numbers. She said to text her anytime I needed someone who understood what it was like rebuilding from this kind of mess. I walked into a completely different bank the following Monday and opened a new savings account. The banker asked what the account was for, and I said a house down payment. She helped me set up automatic transfers from each paycheck, $50 at first. Then I changed it to $100. I logged into the account every few days just to watch the balance grow. Every deposit felt like taking back something Brandon had stolen. The numbers climbed slowly, but they climbed and nobody could access this account except me. No joint ownership, no shared passwords, no way for anyone to transfer money out without my explicit permission. I added an extra security question and two-factor authentication. This money was mine, and it was staying mine. My lawyer called 3 months after I sold the toy collection. Brandon's lawyer had contacted her with a settlement offer. Brandon would drop all claims to the money from the toy sale if I agreed not to pursue him for the debt he'd created with his spending. I didn't even need to think about it. I told my lawyer yes immediately. She said she'd draw up the paperwork and we should have everything finalized within a few weeks. The divorce could be done by the end of the month if Brandon didn't change his mind. I hung up and sat in my apartment feeling lighter than I had since the day I found out about the $14,000. The divorce finalized exactly 3 months and 2 weeks after I sold Brandon's collection. I took the day off work, and Rita drove me to the courthouse. We sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes while I tried to calm my nerves. Rita reminded me that this was a good thing, that I was about to be legally free from someone who'd spent our future on plastic toys. We walked in together and met my lawyer outside the courtroom. Brandon was already there with his lawyer. He looked thinner and tired. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement, confirmed we both agreed to the terms, and signed the decree. It took less than 15 minutes. I walked out with a folder containing my divorce papers and Rita's arm around my shoulders. Rita took me to lunch at a restaurant downtown that had fancy cocktails and small portions. We ordered drinks that cost more than my usual grocery budget, and Rita raised her glass. She said she was proud of me for getting out and starting over. I clinked my glass against hers and took a drink that tasted like freedom mixed with expensive vodka. We ordered appetizers and dessert, and I didn't worry about the cost because I had money in my account that was mine. No toy purchases pending, no secret spending to discover, just my paycheck going toward my life. Rita paid the bill and told me this was her treat for surviving the worst year of my life and coming out stronger. I walked into the tattoo shop 2 weeks after the divorce papers were finalized. The artist was a woman with purple hair and sleeve tattoos covering both arms. I showed her the word I wanted on my wrist. She asked if I was sure about the placement because wrist tattoos hurt more than people expected. I told her I was sure. The needle buzzed and stung as she worked the letters into my skin. The word enough appeared in simple black script. She bandaged it and gave me care instructions. I paid cash and walked out feeling like I'd marked something important on my body. Every time I looked at my wrist now, I'd remember that I didn't have to stay in situations that hurt me. Rita called that evening while I was applying ointment to the tattoo. She asked if I'd seen the Facebook message from Brandon's mom. I hadn't checked Facebook in weeks. Rita read it to me over the phone. Brandon's mom wanted to meet for coffee to discuss reconciliation. She said Brandon had learned his lesson and was ready to be a better husband. I opened Facebook on my laptop and stared at the message. Brandon's mom had written 3 paragraphs about second chances and how divorce was too extreme. I clicked the block button without responding. Rita asked what I did and I told her. She said good, and that I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The relief felt immediate. I blocked Brandon's whole family one by one and felt lighter with each click. My supervisor posted the holiday shift schedule at work the next week. Most nurses were trying to avoid working Thanksgiving and Christmas. I volunteered for both. My coworkers looked at me like I was crazy, but I actually wanted to be there. Working kept me busy, and the holiday pay was double time. I signed up for New Year's Eve, too. The extra money went straight into my savings account that was slowly becoming a house fund again. Being at the hospital felt safer than sitting alone in my apartment thinking about previous holidays with Brandon's family. My patients needed me, and I needed the distraction. I ran into one of the toy collectors at the grocery store 3 weeks later. He was in the cereal aisle reaching for a box when he recognized me. He thanked me for the deals and said he felt bad about the situation but couldn't pass up the prices. I told him I was just glad someone was enjoying those toys. He said he'd sold some of the pieces already for profit and offered to split the money with me. I declined and told him the sale was final. He looked relieved and shook my hand before walking away. The whole interaction took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like closing another door on that chapter. My therapist helped me work through the patterns I'd missed during my marriage. She pointed out how Brandon always had an excuse for not contributing equally. When he was employed, he said he deserved to spend money on himself because he worked hard. When he was unemployed, he said he needed hobbies to stay mentally healthy. Either way, his needs always came before mine. She showed me how I'd made his hobbies my financial responsibility without even realizing it. I'd paid for everything while he spent money on toys. The red flags had been there from early in our relationship, but I'd ignored them. She gave me homework to write down every time I'd made excuses for his behavior. The list filled 3 pages. Rita started coming over for dinner every Thursday night. She brought groceries and taught me how to cook real meals instead of the frozen stuff I lived on during my marriage. We made stir-fry and pasta dishes and chicken with vegetables. She showed me how to meal prep on my days off so I had food ready after long shifts. We'd eat together and talk about everything I'd missed while managing Brandon's chaos. She told me about her dating life and work drama, and I realized how isolated I'd become. I'd stopped seeing friends and family because I was always covering for Brandon or dealing with his latest crisis. Having my sister back in my life felt like remembering who I was before the marriage. My therapist suggested I join a divorce support group that met at the community center on Tuesday evenings. I almost didn't go to the first meeting. Sitting in a circle with strangers sharing personal stories sounded terrible, but I forced myself to walk through the door. 8 people sat in folding chairs drinking bad coffee from paper cups. The facilitator asked everyone to introduce themselves and share one thing they were struggling with. I said my name and admitted I felt stupid for staying in my marriage as long as I did. 3 other people nodded and said they felt the same way. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone. One woman had been married for 15 years before leaving. Another guy had ignored financial abuse for a decade. We weren't stupid. We just loved people who took advantage of that love. I kept going back every week. 6 months after the divorce finalized, my supervisor called me into her office. I thought I was in trouble for something. She told me the charge nurse position on my floor was opening up and she wanted me to apply. The job came with better pay and more regular hours. She said I'd been more focused and reliable lately. I filled out the application that afternoon and got the promotion 2 weeks later. My coworkers congratulated me, and I felt proud of myself for the first time in months. The new schedule meant fewer overnight shifts and more weekends off. I calculated my finances one evening while sitting at my kitchen table. I'd saved almost $8,000 since Brandon left. That was more than half of what he'd spent on toys. The math made me angry all over again when I thought about how easily he'd thrown away our future. But I also felt proud looking at the growing balance. Every dollar represented my work and my choices. Nobody was draining my accounts or lying about spending. Rita called the next week with news she'd heard through mutual friends. Brandon finally got a job at a different warehouse across town. I waited for some feeling to hit me, but nothing came. No anger, no satisfaction, no curiosity about his life. Just relief that he was someone else's problem now. I thanked Rita for telling me and changed the subject to her upcoming birthday plans. Brandon's employment status didn't matter to me anymore. He could succeed or fail and it wouldn't touch my life. That indifference felt like the final piece of moving on. Mom called me 3 days after Brandon finally moved into his warehouse job. She asked if we could meet for coffee and her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. I agreed to meet her at the diner near her house after my morning shift. She was already sitting in a booth when I arrived, hands wrapped around a mug like she needed something to hold on to. She apologized for sending Brandon that money without checking with me first. I watched her stir sugar into coffee that didn't need it while she explained how convincing he'd sounded on the phone, how worried she'd been about us struggling. I told her Brandon manipulated her the same way he manipulated me for months, making me feel guilty for wanting basic financial responsibility. She nodded and said we were both smarter now about his tactics, that she'd never send money to anyone again without calling me directly first. We ordered pancakes neither of us really wanted and talked about other things until the conversation felt normal again. 2 weeks later, Rita convinced me to download a dating app. I spent an entire evening staring at profiles of men holding fish or posing with their cars before matching with a respiratory therapist named Noah from another hospital across town. We texted for a few days about work schedules and favorite restaurants before he suggested coffee. I said yes before I could overthink it. The date happened on a Tuesday afternoon at a cafe halfway between our hospitals. Noah showed up exactly on time wearing scrubs from his morning shift, and I realized I'd forgotten how to do this. How to sit across from someone new and make conversation that wasn't about divorce lawyers or restraining orders. He asked about my job, and I gave the basic rundown of working on a cardiac floor. He talked about his work in the ICU, and we discovered we both hated the new electronic charting system our hospital networks had switched to. The conversation felt awkward, and I kept catching myself comparing him to Brandon, before reminding myself that was exactly what I shouldn't be doing. He ordered a second coffee, and I got tea, and we talked about nothing important for another hour. Walking back to my car afterward, I felt rusty at this whole dating thing, but also good. Like I'd remembered I was allowed to have a life outside of work and recovery from my marriage. Noah texted me that evening asking about a second date. I stared at my phone for 20 minutes before typing out a response saying I'd had a nice time, but wasn't sure I was ready for anything serious right now. He replied within minutes saying he understood and wished me well. I felt relieved instead of disappointed, and realized the date itself didn't matter as much as proving to myself I could do it. I wasn't actually ready for a relationship yet, no matter how nice Noah seemed. I needed more time to trust my own judgment about people after spending 6 years ignoring every red flag Brandon threw up. The following weekend, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called out sick from my Saturday shift even though I wasn't sick and drove 2 hours to the beach. I found a cheap hotel 6 blocks from the water that charged $60 a night and had a view of a parking lot instead of the ocean. I didn't care. I checked in, changed into jeans and a sweatshirt, and walked down to the sand. The beach was mostly empty because it was October and too cold for swimming. I took my shoes off and walked along the waterline for hours, letting the waves wash over my feet until they went numb. I bought an overpriced sandwich from a boardwalk shop and ate it sitting on a bench watching seagulls fight over dropped French fries. That night, I slept in the hotel bed with the window cracked open so I could hear the ocean, and didn't think about Brandon or the divorce or anything except the sound of waves hitting the shore. Sunday morning, I walked the beach again before driving home. The whole trip cost me $200 I could have saved, but it felt worth every penny. Tuesday evening, I went back to the support group at the community center. We'd grown to 12 regular members, and the facilitator asked if anyone had updates to share. I raised my hand and told them about selling Brandon's entire toy collection while he was at a convention. I explained how his collector friends had shown up with cash, how I'd made $21,000 in one afternoon, how Brandon came home to empty shelves and called the police who told him marital assets could be sold by either spouse. The whole group started laughing and then applauding. One woman named Jennifer said I was her hero for taking such decisive action instead of letting the situation drag on. Another guy said he wished he'd thought of something similar before his ex-wife drained their accounts. The facilitator reminded everyone that what worked for me might not work for others, but that setting firm boundaries was important in any situation. I left feeling lighter than I had in weeks. That weekend, I started looking at real estate listings online. I'd been avoiding it because house hunting felt like something married couples did together, but my savings account had grown steadily since Brandon left, and the down payment fund was rebuilding itself. I filtered search results for starter homes in safe neighborhoods near the hospital. Nothing fancy, just something small that would be mine. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, maybe a little yard. I bookmarked 6 properties that looked promising and made notes about which ones had good school districts even though I didn't have kids, because Rita said that mattered for resale value. Rita called me the next morning before I'd even had coffee. She was crying, and I thought something terrible had happened until she said her boyfriend proposed last night at their favorite restaurant. She asked if I'd be her maid of honor, and I said yes immediately, even though the idea of planning someone else's wedding while my own marriage dissolved felt strange. But Rita had been there for me through everything with Brandon, helping me trace the money and open new accounts and find my apartment. Planning her wedding together would be a happy distraction from my own failed marriage. She came over that evening with bridal magazines, and we spent 3 hours looking at dresses and venues and making lists of potential guests. She wanted a small ceremony in the spring with just family and close friends. I took notes and felt genuinely excited for her instead of bitter about my own situation. The following week, I met with a financial advisor Rita recommended from her bank. The woman's name was Olivia, and she had an office that smelled like vanilla candles, and looked at my bank statements with the same focused expression Rita got when analyzing numbers. She helped me create a realistic budget that accounted for my mortgage payment, utilities, car insurance, and still left room for savings and emergencies. She said I was in better shape than most people my age, which felt validating after the financial chaos Brandon had created. Olivia suggested I could probably buy a house within 6 months if I kept saving at my current rate and avoided any major unexpected expenses. I left her office with a folder full of papers and a timeline that made home ownership feel real instead of impossible. My next therapy session happened 2 days later. My therapist noticed I seemed different, more settled somehow. I told her about the beach trip and the support group and meeting with the financial advisor. She said I'd made incredible progress over the past few months and suggested we start spacing out our sessions to every other week instead of weekly. I felt proud hearing that because it meant I was doing better, that I had tools now for recognizing unhealthy patterns and setting boundaries. She reminded me that setbacks were normal, and I could always come back to weekly sessions if I needed to. I scheduled my next appointment for 2 weeks out and walked to my car feeling capable of handling my own life. That Friday, I met with a mortgage broker Rita connected me with through her bank contacts. He ran my credit report and looked at my income statements and pre-approved me for a mortgage up to $250,000. The number felt surreal after years of struggling to save anything while Brandon spent everything on toys. I signed the pre-approval letter and called a real estate agent the broker recommended. She wanted to meet that weekend to start looking at houses. I agreed and spent the rest of the evening scrolling through listings with new eyes, knowing I could actually afford these places. Looking at properties that were completely mine to choose felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Every house I bookmarked represented a future I was building myself, with my own money and my own choices, and nobody could take that away from me. The weekend after my mortgage meeting, an old coworker from the hospital named Jessica texted me asking if I'd heard from Brandon lately. She said he'd reached out to her on Facebook with this long message about how he'd been going to therapy and working on himself, and really needed to talk to me about making things right. Jessica wanted to know if I was open to hearing him out because he seemed really genuine, and kept saying he'd learned so much about his behavior. I stared at my phone for a solid minute before typing back that I wasn't interested in any contact with Brandon whatsoever, and could she please not pass along any messages from him. She responded with an understanding emoji and said she'd let him know. I immediately blocked Jessica's number because I didn't trust that Brandon wouldn't keep using her as a go-between. The whole thing annoyed me more than it upset me, because I'd finally gotten to a place where I wasn't thinking about him every day, and here he was trying to worm his way back into my attention. I mentioned it to my therapist the following week, and she pointed out that Brandon reaching out right when I was about to buy a house probably wasn't a coincidence. He'd always had a way of sensing when I was moving forward and trying to pull me back into his chaos. That observation stuck with me because it was true. Every time I'd made progress during our marriage, he'd created some new crisis that demanded my focus and energy. I spent the next 2 weeks looking at houses online every night after my shifts, scrolling through listings and saving the ones that seemed promising. Most were either too expensive or in neighborhoods I didn't feel safe in or needed too much work for a first-time buyer. Then on a Tuesday morning before heading to the hospital, I found a listing that made me sit up straighter in my kitchen chair. Small brick house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, fenced yard with mature trees, updated kitchen, and a price that was right at the top of what I'd been pre-approved for. The second bedroom was described as perfect for a home office or guest room, and I immediately thought about how nice it would be to have a space for my desk and books, instead of a room full of someone else's plastic toys. The photos showed hardwood floors that needed refinishing and wallpaper in the bathroom that was definitely from the 80s, but nothing that scared me off. I called my real estate agent before my shift started and told her I wanted to see it that same day if possible. She managed to schedule a showing for 6 that evening after the current owners got home from work. Walking through that house felt different from all the other properties I'd toured. The living room had big windows that let in tons of natural light, and the kitchen had enough counter space that I could actually cook real meals instead of just reheating leftovers. The backyard was bigger than I expected, with room for a garden and a small patio area where I could put a table and chairs. The second bedroom was painted this awful shade of yellow, but I could already picture it with my desk against one wall and bookshelves on the other, a space that was mine for working or reading or whatever I wanted. My real estate agent could tell I was trying not to get too excited, but I kept going back to look at different rooms and asking questions about the roof and the furnace and when things had been replaced. She pulled up the inspection report from when the current owners bought it 3 years ago, and everything looked solid. I told her I wanted to put in an offer that night. We sat in her car outside the house and wrote up an offer for exactly the asking price because I didn't want to risk losing it by trying to negotiate. My hands shook a little signing the paperwork because this was real money and a real commitment, and if something went wrong, I'd be stuck. But I signed everything, and my agent submitted the offer through the online system right there in the driveway. The next 36 hours were torture waiting to hear back from the sellers. I picked up an extra shift at the hospital to keep myself distracted, but kept checking my phone every time I had a break. My agent texted me Thursday afternoon saying the sellers had accepted my offer with no changes or counteroffers. I was standing in the medication room when I got the message and had to sit down on the floor because my legs went weak. Happy tears started streaming down my face, and one of the other nurses found me there and thought something terrible had happened until I showed her the text message. She screamed and hugged me, and suddenly half the nursing staff knew I was buying a house. I called Rita during my lunch break, and she actually shrieked so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She started rapid-firing questions about the address and square footage and what the neighborhood was like. When I told her about the second bedroom being an office, she said that was perfect because Brandon's toy room had always creeped her out anyway. My mom called that evening after Rita told her the news and offered to help with moving expenses or furniture or whatever I needed. She kept saying how proud she was that I'd turned everything around after such a difficult year. The home inspection happened the following Tuesday, and I met the inspector at the house during my day off. He was this older guy who'd been doing inspections for 30 years and had a clipboard thick with forms. I followed him around for 3 hours while he poked at things and took photos and made notes. He found some minor issues like a loose railing on the back steps and an outlet in the bathroom that wasn't grounded properly, and some weather stripping around the front door that needed replacing. The roof had about 10 years left on it, and the water heater was 6 years old, so not new but not ancient either. The furnace was running fine, but he recommended getting it serviced before winter. Nothing he found was a deal breaker, but he estimated about $1,500 worth of repairs that should be addressed. I asked if any of it was urgent safety stuff, and he said no, just normal maintenance things that come with an older house. My real estate agent helped me write up a request asking the sellers to fix the railing and the outlet and replace the weather stripping before closing. I offered to handle the furnace servicing myself since that was just routine maintenance. The sellers agreed to everything within 2 days, and suddenly we were moving toward closing. Closing day arrived 3 weeks later on a Friday morning. I'd taken the whole day off work and met my real estate agent at the title company office at 9. The room was small and beige with a huge table covered in stacks of paper that all needed my signature. The title agent was a woman in her 50s who walked me through every single document explaining what I was signing. My hand cramped up after the first 20 minutes from writing my name so many times. The sellers weren't there because they'd signed everything the day before and were already moved out. I signed papers about the mortgage and the title transfer and the homeowner's insurance and the property survey, and about 15 other things I stopped keeping track of. The whole process took almost 2 hours, and by the end I had a folder full of copies and a set of keys on a keychain that said, "Home Sweet Home." My real estate agent shook my hand and told me she loved seeing single women buy their own homes because it meant they were taking control of their lives. She'd handled my whole divorce situation with such professionalism and never once made me feel judged for my circumstances. I walked out to my car holding those keys and just sat there for a few minutes letting it sink in that I owned a house. My house. Nobody could take it away or spend the mortgage money on toys or make me feel guilty for wanting a stable home. Moving into the house over the next week felt like closing a book on my marriage to Brandon. Rita and her fiancé helped me load everything from my apartment into a rented truck on Saturday morning. I didn't have much furniture because Brandon had taken most of it when he moved out, and I'd been living pretty minimal in my small apartment. Every box I unpacked in my new house was something I'd chosen and bought with my own money. The dishes were mine, the towels were mine, the furniture was mine, and nobody could sell any of it to fund some ridiculous hobby. I set up my bedroom first with a new bed frame I'd found on sale, and sheets I'd picked out in colors I actually liked, instead of whatever Brandon had preferred. The second bedroom became my office with a desk I'd bought used, and a bookshelf I'd assembled myself following the instructions. No temperature-controlled shelving for plastic toys, no special lighting for collectibles, just a normal room for normal purposes. I hung pictures on the walls without asking anyone's permission, and arranged my kitchen exactly how I wanted it. Everything about the house was mine to decide and mine to enjoy. Rita and her fiancé came back the following weekend to help me paint the living room. We'd picked out this warm gray color that made the room feel cozy but not dark. Her fiancé turned out to be really good at cutting in around the ceiling and corners, while Rita and I rolled the main walls. We put on music and joked around and took breaks to drink lemonade on my back patio. By Sunday afternoon, the whole room was finished and looked completely different from the dingy beige it had been before. We ordered pizza for dinner and ate it sitting on my living room floor because my furniture hadn't been delivered yet. Rita looked around at the freshly painted walls and said my house already had better energy than my old apartment with Brandon ever had. Her fiancé agreed and said the old place had always felt tense whenever he'd visited during my marriage. I realized they were right, because I felt relaxed in my own home for the first time in years. No tension about money, no worrying about what Brandon was buying behind my back, no walking on eggshells around his mood swings about his collection. 2 weeks after moving in, I hosted my first dinner party with people from the hospital and a few friends from my divorce support group. Everyone brought food potluck style, and we crowded into my small dining area and living room. My coworker from the cardiac unit brought this amazing pasta salad, and one of the support group women made brownies from scratch. We talked and laughed and celebrated my new house and fresh start together. Someone asked me to tell the story about selling Brandon's toy collection, and when I got to the part about him coming home to empty shelves, everyone cheered. One of the support group members said I was her inspiration for finally leaving her own financially irresponsible husband. Hearing that made me feel like maybe something good had come from all the chaos with Brandon. If my story helped even one person recognize they didn't have to tolerate financial abuse, then maybe it was worth sharing. People stayed until almost midnight, and when everyone left, my house felt full of warmth and good memories, instead of the cold silence I'd lived with during my marriage. My mom came over the next weekend with a housewarming gift of new kitchen towels in cheerful colors and a set of matching pot holders. She walked through every room commenting on how nice everything looked and how proud she was of how I'd handled the whole situation with Brandon. We sat on my back patio drinking coffee, and she admitted she'd been worried I would stay with him out of some misplaced sense of loyalty or obligation. She said watching me take control of my finances and my life had reminded her that I'd always been stronger than I gave myself credit for. I told her about Brandon trying to contact me through Jessica, and she rolled her eyes, so hard I thought they might get stuck. She said some people never learned, and Brandon was clearly one of them. We spent the rest of the afternoon planning where I should plant flowers in the front yard and what vegetables would grow best in my backyard garden. The following Saturday, I drove to the garden center and bought flats of petunias and marigolds for the front flower beds. I'd never really gardened before, but figured I could learn as I went. I spent the whole afternoon on my knees in the dirt, digging holes and spacing out the flowers according to the instructions on the tags. My hands got covered in soil and my knees ached from kneeling, but it felt good to be doing physical work on something that was mine. In the backyard, I marked out a space for a vegetable garden and started turning over the soil to prepare it for planting. I'd bought tomato plants and pepper plants and some herb seedlings to start with. Nothing too complicated for a first-timer. The physical work of gardening felt therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected, like I was literally planting roots in my new life. Every flower I put in the ground and every vegetable I planted represented something I was growing and tending and enjoying that belonged completely to me. This house, this garden, this life was mine to build however I wanted without anyone spending my savings on toys or lying about job interviews or making me feel guilty for wanting basic financial stability. At the next support group meeting, One of the women asked me how I found the courage to do what I did with Brandon's toys. I sat there for a minute thinking about her question because courage wasn't really the right word for what I felt. I told her it wasn't courage exactly, more like reaching a point where anger outweighed fear. When you're so mad that you stop caring about the consequences, that's when you finally act. She nodded and wrote down Rita's number at the bank when I offered it. The next week, I sat down with my mortgage statement and my old rent receipts from the apartment Brandon and I shared. I pulled out my calculator and started adding up what I'd been paying versus what I pay now. My house payment came out to $847 a month, including property taxes and insurance. Our old apartment rent was $1,100 plus utilities. I stared at those numbers for a long time, feeling this weird mix of anger and relief. Brandon's toy obsession had literally been costing us an extra $250 every month while preventing us from buying a house that would have been cheaper. All those months I worked overtime thinking we couldn't afford to buy, when really we couldn't afford Brandon's hobby. I filed that paperwork away in my home office and went to make dinner in my kitchen that actually belonged to me. Rita's wedding happened on a Saturday in October when the weather was perfect and the leaves were changing colors. I stood up with her as maid of honor wearing a dress she'd helped me pick out, and I felt genuinely happy watching her marry someone who treated her like an equal partner. During the reception, I caught the bouquet when she threw it and everyone cheered. A year ago, I would have felt weird about that, like I was cursed or something. But now I just laughed and held those flowers up like a trophy. Rita hugged me afterward and told me she was proud of how far I'd come. Her husband's family asked me about my house and my job, and nobody mentioned Brandon once. I danced with my mom and ate too much cake and drove home to my own place feeling completely at peace with how my life turned out. A year after I sold Brandon's collection, I woke up early before a shift and made coffee. I took my mug out to the backyard and sat on the steps watching the sunrise paint the sky orange and pink. My savings account had over $12,000 in it. My house was mine with equity building every month. I was sleeping through the night without waking up anxious about bills or lies or what financial disaster I'd discover next. I sipped my coffee and listened to birds singing in the trees I'd planted and thought about how quiet and calm everything felt now. No packages arriving daily, no credit card surprises, no screaming matches about responsibility and partnership. Just me and my coffee and my house and my life that I built myself. I got a message through Facebook from one of the collectors who'd bought stuff from me during that emergency sale. He thanked me again and said some of the pieces he got had increased in value since then. He'd just sold one of the robot figures for 3 times what he paid me. I laughed out loud reading that message because Brandon had been right about one thing. Those toys did go up in value. But he was completely wrong about everything else that mattered. Wrong about priorities, wrong about partnership, wrong about what it meant to be a responsible adult. That collector got the investment returns because he had the money to sit on collectibles. Brandon spent our future on plastic and expected me to be grateful for his business sense. My therapist told me during our session that we were approaching a good stopping point. I'd been seeing her for 18 months and we'd worked through so much of the damage from my marriage. She said I'd done incredible work healing and rebuilding my life and I should be proud of my growth. We scheduled one final session for the following month to wrap things up properly. Walking out of her office, I felt this sense of accomplishment that was different from other achievements. This wasn't about a promotion or buying a house. This was about fixing the broken parts inside myself that had let Brandon's behavior continue for so long. I'd learned to trust my own judgment again and set boundaries that actually meant something. A new nurse started on my floor who reminded me of myself 2 years ago. She was always tired, always stressed about money, and she had this boyfriend who showed up sometimes to pick her up from shifts. I noticed she'd pay for his gas and his food when they went out. I noticed she made excuses when he didn't have rent money again. One day in the break room, I asked her if everything was okay at home. She started crying and told me about her boyfriend's spending and his promises to change and how she felt trapped. I shared my story carefully, not all the details, but enough that she understood I'd been where she was. I gave her resources, including Rita's number at the bank and the name of my therapist. I told her she deserved a partner, not a dependent. She hugged me and thanked me, and I hoped she'd make better choices faster than I did. An email showed up in my inbox forwarded from my old address that I'd abandoned after the divorce. Brandon had sent it to that old email saying he was sorry for everything and hoped I was doing well. He said he had a steady job now and was doing better. He hoped we could talk sometime if I was open to it. I read it twice and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no curiosity about his life now. Just complete indifference like he was a stranger who'd once lived in my house. I deleted the email without responding and went back to planning my grocery list. Some people don't deserve your energy or your attention, and Brandon had used up his lifetime supply of both. Thanksgiving came and I hosted it at my house for the first time. Rita and her husband came with homemade rolls. My mom brought her famous green bean casserole and pumpkin pie. 3 of my coworkers from the hospital joined us with various dishes and wine. We crowded around my dining table that I'd bought at an estate sale and refinished myself. I looked at all these faces of people I loved and trusted and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Nobody here was hiding financial disasters or lying about job searches or manipulating anyone into paying their way. These were real relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. We ate until we were stuffed and played card games and laughed until my sides hurt. After everyone left and I was cleaning up the kitchen, I felt more thankful than I had in years. The bank sent me a refinance offer in the mail with a better interest rate than my original mortgage. I called them and went through the application process and got approved within 2 weeks. The loan officer commented on my excellent payment history and credit score during our final meeting. I signed the new paperwork and my monthly payment dropped by almost $60. I thought about how Rita had helped me rebuild what Brandon damaged, and now I was thriving. My credit score was higher than it had ever been. My savings were healthy. My house was appreciating in value. I had stability and security that I'd built completely on my own, without anyone undermining it or stealing from it or treating it like their personal fund for toys. 2 years later, I'm sitting across from Noah at a coffee shop near the hospital where we both work. He's a physical therapist who transferred from another facility 6 months ago, and we started talking in the break room about hiking trails and meal prep recipes. He asked me out 3 times before I finally said yes, because I kept finding reasons to be suspicious, even though he'd never given me one. Our first date was coffee and a walk through the park, where he told me about his 2 rescue dogs and his woodworking hobby. He showed me pictures of a bookshelf he'd built for his sister, and talked about his job with genuine enthusiasm. On our second date, he paid for dinner without making a big deal about it and didn't get weird when I offered to split the bill. By the third date, I realized I was looking for red flags that didn't exist, and trying to protect myself from problems that weren't there. Noah has a steady income, contributes to his retirement account, and his apartment is clean without being obsessive about it. He has hobbies that don't cost thousands of dollars, and he's never once asked me for money or made his problems mine to solve. We take things slow because I'm careful now about who I let into my life and my house. He hasn't even been inside my place yet because I need to be sure before I share that space with anyone. But it feels right in a way that's hard to explain, like dating someone who actually has their life together isn't supposed to be this easy. My house appraisal came back last month showing the value increased by almost $30,000 since I bought it. The neighborhood improved with new shops and a park renovation, and suddenly my little 2-bedroom is worth more than I paid. My savings account has enough in it that if my car died tomorrow or I needed emergency dental work, I wouldn't panic about how to pay for it. I can cover 6 months of expenses without touching my retirement, and that number keeps growing every time I get paid. Sitting in my kitchen last week looking at my bank statements, I realized how much constant stress I lived with during my marriage. Every single day was worrying about what Brandon spent, or what bill he forgot, or what lie he told to get more money. I was working overtime just to stay even while he drained everything I earned into his toy collection. Now I work my regular shifts and pick up extra hours when I want to, not because I have to. The financial security feels almost strange because I'm not used to having breathing room or options or the ability to just exist without crisis. My phone buzzes while I'm chopping vegetables for dinner, and it's a text from an unknown number. I almost delete it without reading, but something makes me open it. The message says it's Brandon, and he heard I sold his collection, and he wants to know if I kept records of who bought what, because he wants to buy some pieces back. He says he has money now from his job, and he's been thinking about his collection, and maybe we could talk about it. I stare at the message for about 5 seconds before I block the number and go back to slicing bell peppers. Brandon doesn't get access to my time or my energy or any information about my life anymore. Those toys are gone and scattered to whatever collectors bought them, and that's exactly what should have happened 2 years ago. I finish making stir-fry in my peaceful kitchen where nobody's going to come home and complain about what I'm cooking or ignore me to look at auction sites. Standing in my living room after dinner with a glass of wine, I look around at the life I built from the wreckage of my marriage. The furniture I picked out, the paint colors I chose, the mortgage I pay on time every month. I worked hard for this, made tough choices that hurt at the time, and created something stable that belongs completely to me. I'm genuinely happy in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever feel again after the divorce. Proud of myself for recognizing when enough was enough, and walking away from someone who was dragging me down. This life I have now with financial security and healthy relationships, and a home that's actually mine, is worth more than any toy collection or broken promise ever was.